So welcome everyone to this second of our Scan Horizon informal chats, which hopefully we're expressing some interesting observations of what we're seeing in the market as we go through these incredibly unusual times. Today we've got Peter from Flexiion MSP with us, as well as Eltjo from Leaseweb. And I suppose the informal kind of title of today is, are clouds moving faster than you? And by that, I think we're really meaning, what are the new ways, what's the innovative ways that high-tech companies are using to actually make the most of their use of cloud? So I guess we could start off really by asking, what have been the big changes in the way companies, are using cloud? Eltjo, what are you seeing in the changes of way companies are using the cloud?
Yeah, what we saw in let's say 2014, 15, maybe already a little bit earlier, but we saw a very quick shift from more traditional hosting companies towards the public cloud, the hyperscalers, so AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. Later on, in the beginning, it was mainly AWS. But at the moment, we see not a trend fully back, but we see that people are more thinking before they decide where to host something. In the past, it was cloud only. You had to go to the cloud, and the cloud was the answer on everything. Now we see a trend where customers are considering some parts to be hosted maybe at a hyperscaler, but some on other hosting companies, can be on dedicated servers, sometimes even in co-location, or maybe even in a private cloud. So what we see is that people really look at the load they have, the specific workload, and then try to find the best requirement for that specific load. Is that something you see as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was just thinking, so what's the driver for that? I think there's two things. I think ambitious people are perhaps more confident about the use of the cloud. There was a time when, we just put everything with Amazon and job done. I think now people are being a bit more discriminating. They've also actually perhaps found some of the disadvantages in this provider is good for this but not for that, and so on, and they've all got their wrinkles, and it depends on the precise nature of the workload, as you say. The other thing I think is that there's more innovation going on. I think to be competitive, in particular on those masterful things of having performance and cost and flexibility. In a changing world with, goodness knows, if this isn't a changing world, I don't know what is. But in a changing world, you have to have flexibility. You have to be able to be nimble, because you don't know when you're going to need to make changes. And you have to be super cost sensitive. And of course, you've got to have performance. And whereas, what you're describing is very much there was a time when all workloads were the same, and we either did them here or we all did them there. But now there's data at rest, there's dynamic load, you've got to play into the cost models of some of these things, none of which are particularly simple or ideal. And so I think that the most ambitious people are being innovative in order to get those three things of cost, performance, and flexibility. That's how I see it.
No, I very much agree, and that is also what I see from discussions we have with prospects and customers. And maybe there's even a fourth one, which might be privacy data. Some companies really need to host certain parts of their data in a specific country, and that might be a very good reason to not put it in public cloud. But that's purely for the data. Then you can still nowadays decide to have your application servers, for example, or your web servers at AWS. Just giving examples, it's not an exhaustive list.
As you were talking, Eltjo, I was thinking that we've just launched with a fintech provider, and he's got authentication and policy and central management in London. He's launching the service in South Africa, which needs local compute and store. And next he's off to India, and it's going to need local compute and store there. And managing that flexibly and within cost constraints, getting the right performance, that's today's challenge as I see it.
I fully agree. And next to that, the options to connect your different clouds, then we call it normally hybrid cloud. If it's not connected and just all clouds separated over the world, then we normally call it multi-cloud. But if it's really interconnected, we used to call it hybrid cloud. And if that's the case, sometimes it then doesn't matter so much anymore where you run something, and you can really go for the best performance or for the lowest cost or for exactly what you need. And the options to connect those clouds are definitely a lot better than, let's say, 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, I'm also thinking, about the long-term drivers in here, and we've got software-defined networking coming up. 5G is going to transform the whole concept of what cloud is. It's not going to be this big thing out there somewhere. The whole networking, compute and store is going to be much more flexible and fluid and dynamic. And that's going to bring whole new architectures that are going to drive all of this. It's an interesting world.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah.
But with those added options come, added other things people have got to think about, how they make this more complex environment work for them. So actually they remain master of that environment and the environment not master of them. What do you see, Peter and Eltjo, the kind of things that companies are having to put in place so they can actually take full advantage of these greater options with regards to what part of the cloud they use for what part of their business?
Interesting question. The pragmatic, ambitious customer is more concerned about what his total service looks like, and the need to find the right components to put in there. What you need is service. It's service every time, service and support. And in a world where you have one provider, end of, you've only got one neck to wring, one backside to kick, if you pardon me. And that's, if it's not working, it must be his fault, and that's relatively simple. I think in this world where things are more complex, and we're assembling a gearbox out of a number of cogs, then I think it needs to be approached in a slightly different way. Eltjo, what are you seeing?
No, I agree. And what is really important is that you use the right technology, and that you make the right technology choices up front before you step into a hybrid cloud. For example, if you have a more traditional legacy kind of application, it might be really hard to separate the database from the application servers because they expect a really low latency between them. So it's, when you design your software, it's already really important to think about what kind of technology you will use for hosting your application. If it's purely legacy, we see that it's normally quite hard to set it up in a hybrid cloud. Maybe hybrid in the sense of within one provider with still really low latency between the different parts of your infrastructure. But hosting legacy, where your database is in a complete different data center, then your application servers might become very challenging. But I think it's also a business choice. Do you want that? And what are your reasons to set up a hybrid cloud? Is it to become more high available? That's more a business reason, or is it because of privacy data, or is it to reduce your cost? I think these are all steps that you really have to consider before you make the decision.
And it occurs to me, you know, we've touched a little bit on the, not in any detail, but the technical side and the technical perspective of these business challenges. But I wonder, what's the implication of what I might term as the slightly softer side of the business challenges? And that is, you know, how do you make this work with your particular provider? And, you know, we're talking about more than one provider now. So how do you get the service and support you need without having to continuously fill your company with more and more highly skilled and often quite expensive individuals internally? You know, Peter, how do you see, you know, companies really coming to terms with, as I said, these slightly softer management issues, although them being still very important?
What we're seeing is it's very much dependent on two dimensions. Firstly, there's the complexity dimension, which Eltjo just touched on. If you have a complex application with very stringent operating requirements, then that's tougher to deliver, and it's more sensitive to how you deliver it, and therefore how you support it, than if it's straightforward, I know, a web server with an e-commerce backend or you know, whatever. And I think the other dimension is the stage the business is at. You know, much like a software release will go, you know, dev, test, production. There's almost the same journey for a company. You've got, you know, startup, go to market, scale up, and you know, those things drive the issue as well. Eltjo, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. That there are many drivers also for the soft ones. I think it is important, and that's also what I heard in the question of Simon, to not overcomplicate stuff. So either your contracts with the different providers should be a bit similar. It's something at least to look at. But also the way you manage it, preferably you can just manage it one way and then just spread it over the providers that you use, instead of that you everywhere have to manage it completely separated. And this is where MSPs can definitely help, but sometimes you can also manage it yourself using the right technology.
Eltjo, I mean, Leaseweb have been in this business for quite some time now, you know, and work with some extremely well-established organizations. You know, are you seeing on a reasonably regular basis a change in attitude from those type of companies of how they want to work with you and how they want to consume your kind of services going forward?
Yeah, definitely. We see more and more demand, specifically when we offer dedicated servers. With cloud, it's already more common, but specifically when we offer dedicated servers, we see more and more customers who actually never touch their server anymore. They just speak to our API. They spin off, they roll out their own operating system, and then they manage it completely from using software tools instead of really logging into the machine and doing the work per server.
It's interesting. That's really interesting. This is what I call the progressive abstraction, where the human pushes the complexity further and further away. Now with containers, you know, that's done another level of abstraction. Management tools, that does another layer of abstraction. So the actual tin gets further and further away from you.
I fully agree, but that is definitely what I see more and more, specifically in the kind of customers that we work with a lot, which is mainly not so much startups, but more scale-ups in the fintech, edtech, martech, health tech industry, they normally have very modern SaaS applications, which are completely designed for this kind of hosting.
So infrastructure as code. So
yes,
immediate deployment. Yeah.
So I'm reluctant to introduce the subject of COVID-19 and the global pandemic, but I think, clearly none of us can ignore it. But I wonder, thinking if we can in a slightly more positive way, and what we can see coming down the line in the future, we still have incredible things like AI, Internet of Things, they're still about. And I think, I'm really interested to hear your opinions of how companies are going to look to go beyond where we are now to kind of get back to the enthusiasm that those kind of innovative technologies will bring into the market. Eltjo, do you see companies are now saying, let's try and put what's behind us and let's see what we can do in the future to really, drive ahead?
Well, I think from a business perspective, you see that almost all companies are considering to make working from home more normal, and I don't see that we will all be full-time back in the office longer term. And that is, of course, driving a lot of online technology. So all the companies who offer online learning platforms, online communication platforms like we use now, Zoom, and those kind of companies, we see a huge amount of growth coming from that kind of customers, if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, what are you seeing?
Without question, things like the pandemic have accelerated decision making that was going to happen anyway. It's just happened earlier and more completely and more thoroughly in organizations. I think there's been more organizational change in the last 3 months than there has been in any 3-month period for a long time. And technology has been what's behind that. With that being consolidated and essentially behind us, I think it does a number of things. I think the more online world is more thoroughly through society, certainly in the West now than it has been before, and it's not likely to return. And that means there's much more data. There's much more dependency on IT systems. They're not a nice to have or something I use some of the time. We now completely rely on it, and that's a different mode, and that means we've got to get serious about it. And all of these things have got to be done properly. So resilience and support and all those sorts of things are really, really important. It accelerates the data revolution in the sense that more and more is getting driven by data. There's more and more data around to do that. I actually think AI is just in its infancy. I think the easy wins, the chat bot and all those sorts of things, and all the tricks that Amazon and Google get up to present what they think are the right things when you're searching, all of that stuff, all of those are easy wins for AI, and they've been done. I think there is now neural networks, the fuzzy logic, all of these sorts of things. They're where the next wave of AI is going to be, and that's going to be much more down to the things that Eltjo, you and I have talked about, which is getting the right kind of performance in the right place within your load stack, and those are going to be driving a lot of our world, certainly, and I'm sure Eltjo, you as yours, where we're trying to create the kind of infrastructure that's manageable, flexible, dynamic. It's got great performance, low cost, but it's in a much greater complexity.
No, I fully agree, and well, you can also see that in the change that Leaseweb had in the recent what is it now, 23 years. We were founded in 1997. In the beginning, we were really 100% infrastructure company, just putting servers into racks. Nowadays, I think about 25% of our staff is a development department and no longer racking and stacking servers. That tells a lot about the change and the change that will come further.
Well, great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Eltjo, for that little insight into, as I said, what we are seeing, on a day-to-day basis when we're talking to our customers and our partners, about how they are approaching the use of the cloud. Look, if you find this subject of interest and you've enjoyed this conversation, we'd love to continue it with you. And we'll be putting at the end of this short video the contact details of both Peter and Eltjo, and I'm sure they would be more than happy for you to reach out to them on LinkedIn, etc., and we can continue this conversation with you going forward. So once again, Peter and Eltjo, thank you. If you anything you'd like to say before we go.
No, that's great. Thank you, Eltjo. That's been
you too.
Interesting.